Hello, welcome to another episode of the Let People Prosper Show. My name is Dr. Vance Guillen, and I have the pleasure to talk with Dr. Peter Boettke today of George Mason University and at the Mercatus Center, and he's just done a lot of great things, and we're going to have a good discussion about economics and what economics means and the writings, the history of economics. We've got a lot of good books to go through and really figure out, the best ways to let people prosper, which is the ultimate goal of this show and the work that we're thinking about and doing. So I really am pleased to have Peter Boettke on the show. So Pete, thank you for being on the show today.
I'm thrilled to be here with you, Vance.
Good. So let me do a quick intro for Dr. Boettke. So he's a university professor of economics and philosophy at George Mason University and director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Pete, we were already chatting beforehand, and there's a lot of good things to discuss today. And the first question that I really like to ask those that come on the show is, why do you do what you do? What really got you in economics? What creates this passion that I know that you have, and I've studied and watched you for so many years? Why do you do what you do, Pete?
Well, like most people that I think go on to become professors, I had a fantastic professor in economics that really changed my life and my aspirations about what I wanted to do. I did not go to college to become a scholar. I didn't go to college to become an economist. I wanted to be a high school basketball coach. That's what I went to college to study. And I was dead set on doing that. And for a variety of reasons, the summer, before I went off to Grove City College, I had a job where I was involved in digging pools for a while. And I, had to experience the consequences of the long gas lines that were involved in that. And that piqued my curiosity because of frustration about having to deal with those issues. I don't have to go into much details of that, but I show up in college in 1979. I have to take an econ course as part of a general requirement. I'm sitting in the back of the room, like everyone else, like, why the hell am I here? I got to get on to other things, and work on becoming a high school basketball coach. And, the professor his name was Hans Senholz. He's a very dynamic speaker. He turned me on to the beauty of economic logic. It clicked like that, and the message. And, I think some people, economics is a hard subject. It's counterintuitive, but some people, and I happen to be one of them, economics came easy to me. So again, once I got, this professor got me excited, pointed me to the books. And when I read the books, I'm not saying they were easy for me to read. They were hard to read, but I was able to understand the argument in them, very quickly. And so I became a complete convert to economics much sooner than I even remember it. I mean, my wife's friends who we went to college with, they, in retrospect, they'll talk about me even lecturing them about economics, as when I didn't think I wasn't doing that until maybe my senior year. They're like, no, early on you were telling us, and it is true. Both my parents have passed away now, and we received some of the materials from things that I had, from those times. And I gave my dad, when Free to Choose came out as a brand new book, I gave that to my dad for his Christmas present.
Yeah.
And my aunt, who passed away, her letters reverted back to me. And there was a letter from my dad to my aunt when I was first at Grove City. And the letter has very little to do with sports, which is the only thing I ever would have written to my dad about in the past. Remember, there's no email then. Yeah. Phone cost money. It wasn't like on a cell program. There was only one phone in our whole dorm hall, which is, down and things. So, and you had to call with your quarters and stuff. So I wasn't doing that. So I wrote my dad a letter, and this letter, it's a 3-page long letter. And 2/3 of the letter are all about economics. And when I read it, I was 19 years old, right? I mean, I was like a kid. And I'm like, oh my God, like there's no way that I would have written that to my dad, but I'm writing this whole long thing about, the inflation rates in the late 70s
Wow.
and, all these kind of things like that. And then the last paragraph is, oh yeah, like, sports going well, everything's, good here, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it was such a weird thing for me, because if you would have said to me before I saw the letter, did you ever write your dad a letter about economics? It's like, no, I only would have told him about what was going on with basketball, or then later on with tennis or something. But no, I actually, didn't even write to him about that. I was writing to him about economics because Sennholz so changed my life.
Wow.
But let me just say something about what Sennholz did, because he was really a great public lecturer. And so his lectures in class were not like a normal teacher's lecture. They were more like public lectures about economics.
Wow. Yeah.
That you would hear like at a dinner talk or something like that. So, but what he did do was he pointed us to books. So, very early in my process, I was reading Henry Hazlitt, and Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson is just a really great book to learn from. Obviously, even in 1970s, his examples from the 40s are old. Yeah. But they resonate, and so from that, then it was also Bastiat. Yeah. So we read Bastiat and we read, Hazlitt. And then, from that, you read, Mises and Hayek, but a lot of Milton Friedman, Sennholz himself, his columns. And so I was introduced to this world. And then from that, I got introduced to the great classics in economics early on in my education. So my sophomore year of college, I read Adam Smith, I read John Stuart Mill, I read David Ricardo, I read Say, which is very interesting. Sennholz, because of who he is, put a lot of emphasis on John Baptista Say and learning about Say's law. And I got more on Say than on Ricardo. So, while Ricardo was the architecture of economic logic and structure, we learned more from Say. We read more Say. And then Mill, and then, and then into the 20th century. And so I learned about economics through these classic books and the conversation that was involved in these classic books. And I think that meant my education was unusual. Yeah. Whereas most of my peers in their second year would have been preoccupied only with learning models, right? And learning, they learn perfect supply and demand. By sophomore year, you're studying, indifference curves and perfect competition and monopoly and all that stuff like that. And I learned that stuff as well, but that wasn't what my main learning was. My main learning was learning Adam Smith and the invisible hand, Say and Say's law of the market, and Ricardo and comparative advantage. And, and so and Sennholz also, and I should stress this because I'm not, I haven't led that on yet, but Sennholz thought that we had to be knowledgeable of the critics. So he taught us a lot from Marx, Veblen, and Keynes and Galbraith. Those were the four people. So if you go to my bookshelf to this day, I think I have the collected works of John Kenneth Galbraith on my bookshelf that go all the way back to undergraduate school. So Sennholz taught us about economics as part of a book conversation, right? And so where I learned about Galbraith was through reading The Affluent Society or The New Industrial State, not, reading like an article by Galbraith or something like that. And so it was all about books. Same thing with Keynes. We read the General Theory and Veblen, the conspicuous consumption kind of ideas and, the engineers in the price system kind of stuff. And so he taught us that. And so, anyway, I'm going on too long. No. But that's a very unusual education in economics, but it was an education that really transformed me from first seeing the logic and beauty of economics with supply and demand to then seeing the scholarly scope of economics. And so that set me up then for when I finally got to really wrestle with Mises and Hayek and Kerzner and these other people who are these giant scholars. Yeah. The other thing I should mention is that as an undergraduate, I was really, I really was very influenced by Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State, which I think is a very logical presentation of economics and walks you from soup to nuts, through the whole thing. And so there's a kind of a logical progression. I think it's a very powerful book. Yep. So anyway.
No, that's good. That's a great way to start, Pete. And if you were to dig into that a little bit more, in driving in, okay, this is why you study economics, why you fell in love with economics. Is there something deeper than that, than just the economics itself that you're trying to drive at within your life and in your career?
So, I mean, I think that's matured as I've gone along, right? But I think the first thing, and it's never left me, is the power of supply and demand. Like literally just simple, basic economics. During the financial crisis, I listened to a wonderful podcast that you had with Casey Mulligan, and, in the redistribution recession, I actually had him come out and give a talk, when the book first came out at Mason. And, I'm summarizing him in a little too much of a quick and fast way. But, in some sense, what that book shows is that if you, lower the cost of being unemployed and you raise the cost of employing people, you're going to get more unemployment. Right. And so, in some sense, he demonstrates this with and you don't need to, have complicated economics or anything like that. And so one of the things I like to stress all the time is that simple economics is not necessarily simple-minded. Yeah. You can have simple-minded, economics, but that's not necessarily the same thing as simple, basic economics. Yeah. So to me, the most beautiful thing is the pure logic of working through the logic of choice and situational logic of exchange and seeing the play of supply and demand analysis just right in front of you. And so my first thing is that particular thing is a science, in the same way that, dropping an object's going to fall to the ground or whatever it is. So I always say to my students that economics has the same, ontological status as physics, as a science, but a different set of epistemological procedures. Right. Because we don't have the same way to do controlled experiments that they do in physics. So we have different things going on. But it's that beauty of economics that first attracts me, Vance, and I want to communicate that best. Then there's implications of that, because that supply and demand, if you peel back the layers, you realize that it requires us to have enforceable and exchangeable property rights. And those property rights, those mine and thine, must be recognized, right? So you need property, prices, and profit and loss, but you can't get the prices without property, and you can't get the profit and loss without the prices. And so it all comes down to what David Hume referred to as, property, contract, and consent, right? So we have to have these core institutions for us to be able to do it. And then, okay, so what are the defenses of those core institutions? Yeah. And then you're into the broader issue of basically liberalism and the history of the liberal doctrine of governance and all that. And so then that becomes part of it. So economics becomes political economy becomes social philosophy. And so that's how I see the linkage between all of them. Yeah. So, and I find all three of the levels to be fascinating conversations. Yeah. So, yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. And, I have to talk about the reason why I got into economics was really a tool kind of in my tool belt, in order to, I felt like my calling was really to let people prosper. And the two tools that I have on one hip is the Bible and one hip is economics. And that's just me. And so that's where I kind of see the prism through in the worldview. And, I also had a key professor, Dr. Ronald Gilbert at Texas Tech, who ended up being the chair of my dissertation committee and everything else. And he was the one that handed me Capitalism and Freedom in my junior year. And he was like, you need to read this. And it changed my mind. It changed my whole worldview. As someone who was a rocker and a drummer, growing up, I wasn't really into it too much, but I knew economics really made so much sense about the way the world works and everything else. And then in 2010, I'll never forget this. I went to Scholarship in a Free Society, one of IHS summer seminars in Bryn Mawr, and that was the first time I met you, Pete. I don't know if you remember that, but it was you, Steve Horowitz. I know y'all are very close, and he's amazing. And I miss all his posts and everything all the time. And but Mark Pennington, there were just a number. It was an all-star crew that I honestly didn't know. And it was my first foray into, Austrian economics and what I really considered to just be economics, like getting down to the principles, pushing to the side all this math and everything else that overcomplicates it, to your point about simplifying it. it made so much sense, and everything started so since then, I've kind of been on that sort of path of learning more about economics, digging into the books, like you were saying, and going back, starting from the roots of where mainline economics, I know you talk a lot about mainline versus mainstream economics, and that really got me started down that path.
Yeah, let me tell you two stories related to your prosperity point. One is an old story is that I've done a lot with this wonderful university in Guatemala, University Francisco Marroquin. And I was being interviewed down there, and they asked me, what would I tell a young person who cared passionately about poverty and wanted to work to eradicate poverty in their villages or in their neighborhoods or whatever? And, I started out answering the question, talking to them about reading, Milton Friedman and, everything like that. And then I said, oh, wait a minute, stop. I said, really, what I would tell them is open up a business and hire people and put people. That's where you're going to alleviate poverty, is actually being an entrepreneur and whatnot. And I think that this is a really crucial idea. And so my second story is that during the pandemic, one of my favorite books that I read was a book by Matt Ridley. It's called How Innovation Works, right? And he has a great line in there where he says that innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. And that really gets you thinking, like that passage. Think about that. Well, that's what McCloskey has tried to articulate in her work on the bourgeois trilogy, and then her book on Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, which is that. But one of the most, in contemplating all that, one of the most powerful paragraphs I've ever read in economics actually is the very end of Thomas Sowell's Knowledge and Decisions. So a lot of people don't read Sowell's Knowledge and Decisions. It's probably his most economically technical book at some level. Maybe that or his book.
It's my favorite of it.
It's an amazing book. And in the last paragraph, what he basically says is that at the end of the day, what we to let people prosper requires is that you give elbow room to ordinary people. And so the idea here is that in a proper understanding of economics, ordinary individuals are capable of doing extraordinary things if only given the freedom and the opportunity to do so. And I think most people think of that you need to have extraordinary people who can do extraordinary things if we only give them the power, to do it. And I think that contrast between those two visions, like this is an old vision thing of Sowell, right? Of these two visions between, this idea that you need to have the extraordinary people with extraordinary power, and then they'll be able to achieve great things, versus ordinary people that just need freedom and opportunity, and they'll achieve extraordinary things. I think that vision and that faith in people is ultimately what drives me, what you're talking, because again, remember when I went off to college, I wasn't going off to Harvard to think I was going to become, the advisor to the government or whatever. I wanted to be a local high school basketball coach, back in New Jersey. I just, I live a normal life, walk to school and teach the kids, high school, whatever, and, history or whatever, and teach basketball. And that was it. And so to me, I have tremendous faith that ordinary people are capable of coming up with the most amazing things. And I don't have much faith in extraordinary people that are given extraordinary. I think they tend to get us in trouble.
Yes.
So I'm worried about bad men doing harm. So I want to constrain them, and I want to unleash ordinary people, right? And see that. And that's the opportunity economy. That's letting people prosper, right? That's giving freedom to, everyone, not just the select few. And I think that's the key issue that comes out of it. And that drives me and drives a lot of what I think about. What are the environments that cultivate the individuals? And in modeling and economics, I want to give priority to the agents in the model rather than the theorists of the model. So I want to see the creativity and cleverness be granted to the agents that populate the worlds that I'm studying, not the theorist who is the only one who can come up with the solution.
Oh, man, so good. That's good stuff there. I think one of the other economists that I want to get your take on that doesn't get a lot of traction, maybe in our circles he does, but is Douglas North. and the importance of institutions. Usually whenever somebody asks me what school of economics are you, Vance, I'm like, well, I'm just a free market economist. I don't really apply to everyone, just one. I think it probably is a combination of, Hayek and Mises with the Austrian school, Friedman with the Chicago school, North with the new institutional economics, and then James Buchanan with public choice economics. I mean, probably if you fit those in together, which honestly, Pete, I think you embody that. I mean, I don't know which ones you say that you apply to most, but my guess is it's probably a combination of those as well. Wouldn't you say?
So, I mean, I guess to the external outside world, they would most identify me with, Austrian economics. But the reality is that, I was a student of Kenneth Boulding's. I was a student of Jim Buchanan's as well. And I published a paper of Buchanan's. So I don't shy away from the Austrian label. So don't get me anything wrong there. But I also think that both Mises and Hayek were more like what you're talking about than people say they were, which is that they were very open to whatever good economics was floating around. They didn't have any slavish devotion to any particular writers. I mean, they thought Menger was a better economist than Walras and Jevons, but they didn't think that Menger was the only good economist. They learned from the economists in Sweden. They learned from Frank Knight. They learned from other economists over the years. And so Buchanan has this essay, which I recommend to your listeners. It's called On Hayek. It was written in 1979, but not published until 2015 in the RAE. Okay. So I published this piece in the journal that I edit. In it, he says at the very end that rather than see these schools of thought as competing, we have to have a consilience and see them as fitting together. And he lists four, which are property rights economics of Alchin, the law and economics of Coase, the public choice economics of him and Tulloch, and the market process economics of Mises, Hayek, and Kerzner. Okay? So all four of those. Now, Doug North fits in that same realm because he's transaction costs and property rights. So that would be the new institutional economics. And that's some cross between Alchin and Coase and, these things or whatever. Yeah. So I would fit Doug North in there. I'd fit, Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom in there. I would fit Vernon Smith and Charlie Plott, in there for experimental economics. And so this is why I have this term mainline economics. Yep. So mainline economics is really all those economists that derive the invisible hand proposition from the rational choice postulate via institutions. So that it has to be that role that property, contract, and consent play in translating our self-interest into the public interest, right? And so Adam Smith, so we're all Smithian economists in this regard, as McCloskey points out. And appropriately so. And it's key important to keep in mind that Adam Smith did not say individuals pursuing their self-interest under any conceivable institutions generates a publicly desirable outcome. In fact, you could have self-interested agents produce a really terrible outcome. As an example, he used schooling. The difference between education in Oxford, where the dons were paid out of an endowment, versus the education in Glasgow, in which the dons were paid by student fees. And his argument is that the student fees incentivized the professors to be better professors, whereas where they didn't have to do that. And he applies it to the church as well, right? When when the ministers are paid out of a state endowment, they're not going to exhibit much religiosity. No. They're not going to get people to teach the gospel the right way. It's like in the old the Princess Bride. Remember when the priest gets up to Mary and he says, "Today we will have marriage," is completely boring and everything like that, right? Versus, let's say that if you went into, your typical Pentecostal church or whatever, right? So there'd be like a difference in the way to get people to come to the church that you would behave differently. Smith understood those ideas and it's just simple, basic logic of economics. And so to me, that's the power of the role that we interact. So what good economics is, Milton Friedman was right. There's only good economics and bad economics. And so we define good economics in a variety of ways. Hazlitt and Bastiat, it was, you don't see just the seen, you see also the unseen, right? I agree with that 100%. But what I'm also sort of arguing that it's also that you have to pay attention to the institutional framework within which economic activity takes place. So to me, following Buchanan, economics is about exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. And so we want to look at the exchange relations that are being forged on the market, but we also have to look at what institutions impact that.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And it's something I'm continuing to learn from and ensure that what I'm doing and trying to see through that prism, that lens of how to see the world and through the economy and in our economy, to allow for those, private property rights to be as strong as possible, for the institutions, marriage or families, to ensure that families have the freedom to do what's in their best interest to satisfy their desires along the way. One of the other things, Pete, that a lot of people won't know is that how instrumental you were to me whenever I was at the White House. And when we had those conversations, there were only two people that I talked with at that time whenever COVID hit, and I was chief economist for the Office of Management and Budget at the time, and there was so much stuff that was going on, and it was fast paced. Every day there was something new. I mean, I found myself in the Situation Room, being a person who went from homeschool, very low income growing up, first generation college student, and now I'm in the Situation Room, and thinking, and you really helped me to think through these things because there weren't easy answers at that time.
If you remember, you sent me on a very, very important learning lesson because I went and I looked at, what Mises had to say during crisis situations when he was in that situation. Yeah. So, Mises at the chamber in Vienna is the equivalent of the CEA in the United States. That's the same kind of position he was in. And, he was fixed with situations, coming out of a war and the Treaty of Versailles, but then also, the issue of, hyperinflation that hit them and other kind of crises. And so, what is it that you argue in the process of those kind of things, so that you can, stay afloat to fight another day, right? In some sense. And so, those are very important ideas. So in my, in my book with Alex, that you had Alex on there, it goes back. There's a funny issue there, right? It's called money and the rule of law. So, why would the rule of law relate to central bank policy, right? Why would the rule of law relate? It all has to do with what you're talking about. Predictability, the rules, creating the environment, what Higgs calls regime uncertainty. If we shift the rules of the game so much, we end up by creating regime uncertainty, which then adds to this. So one of the most important things to do during crises, right, is to actually address the crises, but in a way that doesn't cause regime uncertainty. And so this, again, was what, Mulligan was talking to you about, which I can't recommend your conversation with him enough because he's such a solid economist. And he presented to you just basically the straight up incentives, that was created. I think one of the really, amazing lines, think about that, was he says, we can't ask people to work that will cost them more to work than it does for them to go to work. And he says, everyone understands that, right? That, if you tell a guy that if he goes to work, he's going to make 40, but he's going to have to pay 50 or whatever, then, he's not going to go to work. So he's, and so this was an amazing thing that we did that. We did that and that created problems. And so, going back to COVID in retrospect, one of the things that's fascinating to me is I'm sure that you've watched this video, but maybe your listeners haven't. It's by Hans Riesling.
Yep.
It's called 200 Countries Over 200 Years in 4 Minutes.
Yep. I'll put that in the show notes too. Yeah. Yeah.
So what's fascinating about that is when you watch it and he gets to 1919 and the influenza. He goes like this, because they did it. He goes, what a catastrophe. But look what happens. It's a perfect P. It comes right back, right? It's like, what a catastrophe. The problem that we're wrestling with is that we might actually be like, what a catastrophe, right? And so why did that happen like that? Is it the disease that caused that? That's one thing, the variants and, that, or is it policy? And so what we always have to do is step back and think to ourselves, is the fury of nature being compounded by the folly of mankind? If the fury of nature is real, nature is red in tooth and claw, and we have to admit big hairy problems that can exist. But the question is, do our policies minimize the damage of that, or do they exacerbate the damage of that? And what Mulligan was trying to get across is that we did a lot of things that might have exacerbated it rather than minimized it. And so we don't get, what a catastrophe. Yep. We get the stretch out, which is like, geez, we should know better by now. But again, in the brine of politics and in the state of an emergency, it's tough going. It's not easy to figure out.
No, that's exactly. And there were so many discussions that were going on, of Fauci and Birx, and of course they were really concerned about the health. I mean, that's their expertise. The thing that bothered me, about it is they weren't looking as much at the trade-offs. There wasn't that discussion as much of the trade-offs that was going on, and that's where I kept feeling like I was pounding my head against the wall. Of course, there were some that did. I would, say Russ Vogt, Larry Kudlow. I mean, there were some that were trying to get these points across. But at the end of the day, it's very difficult when you start seeing all those charts. How many people, how many deaths there could be, and everything else. And one of the big other catastrophes that I think, and we can move on to something else, was that, but we moved the entrepreneur to the sidelines. We forced them to the sidelines. So Operation Warp Speed, I think, had some benefits. But how much faster would have things happened had we not sidelined the entrepreneur?
Yeah, you got to look at 1956 when they had and how the Merck entrepreneur was the one who came up with the vaccine so quickly, and it was outside of the official hunt. But I think that it's deeper than that, in the sense that what happened was the entrepreneur wasn't just sidelined in the search for that, or we picked the winner in that one, right? But that therapeutics and other kinds of things, and other ways in which businesses could have had to survive, and so by deciding what was essential and what was not, and we did that. So Ben Powell and I edited a special issue of the Southern Economics Journal. And there's some really good papers on this issue in there. But I think that's and I have a paper called Liberalism Tested, which is about the coronavirus and the idea of the thought experiment that I think we didn't engage enough in, which was how we could have decentralized mechanisms that could maybe meet John Stuart Mill's harm principle test. I'm not saying that we could. This is important for me to point out. I'm not saying that we could. I'm saying that we should have thought about it. And that even if the policy was going in one direction, we should have encouraged the conversation in the scientific community to continue. And the thing that I find most frustrating with both Fauci and Birx is not that they did what they did, because in many ways that's expected. They come from that community. They come out of, infectious disease community. They're germaphobes in general, and all of that. But what I don't like is now they're admitting that they lied to public officials on purpose in order to, and second, they work to suppress alternative points of view from being debated in the scientific community. It wasn't like the people that they tried to suppress were having an influence in government. You know what I mean? It's not, I know Scott Atlas was there or whatever, but it's not like, given that world, that they were going to actually, as you said, with those charts going that way, it was just giving people pause to think a little bit, to discuss, to debate, to maybe consider an alternative point of view. And that's what science is. Richard Feynman, the great physicist, he has what I think the most important scientific attitude. So it's not testing and other kinds of things that people think. Those are like procedures that we do in science. But what Feynman said is the attitude is that you should never worry about asking a question that cannot be answered, but you should always fear an answer that can't be questioned. And the problem is at the height of the coronavirus, from my point of view as an outsider looking in, it seemed like some of the main decision makers were saying these are answers that should not be questioned. And that's when science stops. And I think that that's a real problem. And what we should have done is understand that, policy is going to be policy. It's going to come out of the brine of politics, everything like that. But science in real time is really hard. It's not an easy thing to do. But what we should have had in our public space is a conversation going on, and that would have affected the public deliberations and whatnot. And you wouldn't have maybe had the kind of reaction that some people had, like the gym owner in New Jersey, having to fight for his space, in his gym club or whatever, and being shut down, and having the police state basically come in. He felt like he was part of the conversation. Maybe he wouldn't have felt that way, but he felt like no one wanted to listen to him. No one was respecting his property, his right to have an existence. And so, of course, he's going to be like that. And same thing with certain restaurant owners, like the guy in Brooklyn. And, I'm picking out, these are cherry-picked examples, obviously. But, they were more systemic than we think. Well, and I think this is a real problem.
Yep, no, I agree. And it reminds me of your other good book here, Living Economics, which has been a little while now, right? When was this? This was 2012. So
2012.
A decade ago now. But it reminded me of this part 3 on the practice of economics. And I remember when I was at the White House, I read that part again because he had these 4 chapters, and I'd love for you to respond. But, where did economics go wrong? Modern economics is a flight from reality, right? That made a lot of sense at that time. Man as machine, the limits of economic expertise. Oh, my goodness. There's so many limits there. And then high priests and lowly philosophers. I read that part again at that time, and it just hit home. Like, there was so much that was going on at that time. It's like, yes, that's exactly what's happening.
I think our problem, I think that if you read Hayek's Nobel lecture, The Pretense of Knowledge, a lot of what I'm trying to communicate in that last part of the book is embedded in there. Or if you read the Eleanor Ostrom's Nobel lecture in her last paragraph of her Nobel lecture, where she also says that we have to stop acting as if we could nudge people around and instead talk about creating institutions that cultivate the creativity of individuals. I think that's a core message of Coase as well, which is that, again, the creative and clever people that populate the economy, they run into problems of conflict, right? But where you do is you clarify the rights so they can negotiate away their conflicts. That's the point of Coasean bargains. Not that the judge can somehow determine the optimal allocation, right? Mm-hmm. The judge clarifies the property rights to put it back on the agents to negotiate. And Buchanan's Nobel in the first paragraph says we must cease as if our task is to offer advice to benevolent despots, right? And so it's a different attitude about what the economist's role in society is like. It's not saying that the economist doesn't have technical knowledge. We do, right? But our technical knowledge doesn't trump everyone else's technical knowledge, just like an epidemiologist doesn't trump everyone else's knowledge. And instead, the only way that we can have this in democratic deliberation is to actually treat our suggestions as hypotheses to be tested in the democratic process of collective decision making. And when we assume monopoly expertise status, then we're in trouble. And that's, and this is, goes back to the book on the Fed as well, and other things. And it's an attempt to try to strive to have a kind of environment in the policy space, which is different than expertise that has monopoly status. So recognizing specialized knowledge, recognizing specialized experience, in many ways, let's say we go back to 2010, 2008, 2009, you could probably not have asked for a better head of the Fed than Ben Bernanke, given his past, his temperament, and everything like that, right? Because he was one of the world's leading experts on the Great Depression, right? He is a very sober person, not, one flight to, craziness or whatever. And then just think about, how difficult the task he had in managing and in retrospect, whether or not, we think what he did was such a great job or not, right? I mean, and these things, but a priori going in before that, if you said, could you pick an economist today that should, hit us when we get hit with a crisis like that's next to the Great Depression or whatever, you'd be like, Ben Bernanke, sign him up. So I think that, we need to recognize this expertise, but recognize that what we need is constant nodes of contestation so that the conversation doesn't get ossified and therefore only one size fits all kind of idea. And that requires, very creative thinking about our fundamental institutions.
Well, it certainly does. And I think that brings us to the next thing I wanted to mention was your other book was on public governance and the classical liberal perspective. So this was in 2019. Yeah. And one of the things that I think is missing right now is the discussion of classical liberalism. And it's feeding into our political discourse and the assumptions that are being made by a lot of policymakers and policy thinkers today. Some of what I've seen, Pete, has been the assumptions that I think we share, right? We're strong private property rights, maybe limited government, those sort of things that provide the institutional framework that's going to let people prosper and satisfy their desires. And it's usually my default, right? Is just to be frank about it, is it's usually a government problem. It's a government failure, not a market failure. And what I'm seeing more and more from on the right, whether you want to call it the national conservatism, conservative populism, things of that nature, is that the assumption isn't that the government's the problem anymore. Kind of where President Reagan said government's the problem. It's big tech's the problem. Big banks are the problem. It's something in the private sector that is the problem. And not saying that there aren't issues that are going on in each one of those markets, but let's look at what the basis is, what the institutional framework that's being set up. It's usually an issue of what's happening with government, not the market. Yeah. They're just playing within that game that they're given and given the incentives that are in place. And it's like, look, before you try to come up with a new government solution to solve a government problem, let's actually solve the first government problem. Do you find that as well when you're reading a lot of this?
Well, it's interesting that I'm reviewing a book right now by Sam Gregg, which is trying to address some of these national conservative arguments and stuff. And I think it's very useful for people that are free market oriented to turn their eyes away from necessarily always the Democratic left and turn it to this rising tide of American conservatism and the way in which they're pushing things, which is protectionist, nationalistic, tribalistic, jingoistic. I mean, it's very seriously problematic. And from an economic point of view, and I think you even had some of that while you were in the White House that you needed to deal with, and as well as Casey having to deal with that when he was there as well, and some of the attitudes that people had there about that. But leave that for another conversation. Yeah. But in that book on public governance, we're very much trying to make an argument about the institutions that are institutions of governance that are most conducive to a society in which normative individualism matters, and that democratic ways of living matter. By democratic ways of living, we don't mean, one person, one vote. We mean democratic ways of interacting with each other, that we're one another's dignified equals. And so therefore, the way that we treat other individuals as we meet them in the public square matters. And so our argument is that in there, we stress the idea of more decentralization, federalism. The key idea there is an economic idea that you match the size of the externality or the extent of the externality with the decision unit. So I don't need a national government to collect my garbage, but I might need a national government to provide for my army, right? And so, we scale up. And so this is, basically the issue of subsidiarity in government and whatnot, and then building in nodes of contestation in each one of those areas so they have checks and balances. And so something like the independent regulatory agencies that rose in the progressive era and continue to this day are antithetical to that. And it takes us away. So one of those would be the FDA. And, I understand the radical implications of that. And we lay that argument out in there. In my book, Struggle for a Better World, I try to make the argument a little slightly differently, which is the meta argument, which is about civility. So it's still grounded in this idea of these democratic ways of relating, but it also has this key idea of civility, which I get from the sociologist Ed Shills, which is that civility matters. And so the idea here is that we have to have the most amount of civility at the highest levels of government, because then it trickles down. And when our current issue becomes lack of civility, so then the question is, and I don't answer this in the book, but I do know answers to it that I get from Buchanan and from Knight, which is that one of the reasons why we have lost our lack of civility is because we turn to politics for our sense of truth too much. So we've over politicized our lives. People might hear that in different ways. What I mean is that when we think that politics is a realm of truth, when my truth is not being listened to, my only recourse is to try to impose truth on others who are peddling in falsehood. That's different than I view politics as an arena of a conversation and concessions and compromise, right? And so it's about power sharing and power and taking turns. You win this time, then tomorrow you win this time. And the point is that because politics, ultimately, at the end of the day, democratic politics, meaning one person, one vote, that to politics comes down to minimum winning coalitions, right? I want to get the minimum winning coalition I need to get in order to get my bill passed. But those coalitions are constantly shifting. As long as they're shifting, we feel, and so there's cyclical nature of politics. We feel like, okay, I lost today, but I'll win tomorrow, right? And therefore I can play that game of compromise. But if I feel that I am permanently eliminated from the conversation so that there's a permanent winning coalition, my only recourse is anger because I've been excluded from the conversation. That's a world where we lack civility. That's a world where we lack, and it's because we attributed too much truth to politics. And what I mean by that is that we've turned politics now into the religious wars of our past, which we hope to escape from. Because again, in the religious wars of the past, if you didn't convert to what it is that my truth of religion was, you were a heathen, condemned to hell. So of course, what's my job? I have to convert you, right? And so we now have these new religions, and the new religion is in politics. And either you're on this side or you're that side, and the other side is evil and stupid, and I have to discard them and everything like that. And so what we need to do is we need to get back to a world where, we disagree about policy, but we don't view the other person as a heathen that needs to be eliminated from the scene. And that's going to take us some work because we've gone so far back. And so my colleague, that was my co-author on the governance book, Paul Alagica, he's working on a whole project right now called the modus vivendi, which is a resurrection of the old argument of live and let live, and how do we get to a live and let live equilibrium of the world. And he's doing that project with some group of people at Mercatus, but also at the University of Pittsburgh, the Mertzensvilles, who have a center for governance at the University of Pittsburgh. And I'm very enthusiastic about what they might be able to bring back, but we'll see. But it's a long way off. But my book, The Struggle for a Better World, is a collection of essays over the last 20 years where I've been given a chance to give these kind of summary lectures. So it's not like really my research. It's more like summary lectures of that. But it's all trying to hit home this theme of how it is that we try to battle for a world where we give more liberty and less power, and give more, space to those ordinary people to do those extraordinary things, and less power to the extraordinary people. And it's about institutions. It's about exchange.
That's right. That's right. And here's the picture of it, and I'll put it in the show notes as well. But I think out of all your books, that one, I guess, resonated with me the most as far as my Let People Prosper sort of calling and the approach that I'm taking, because it all started to fit together. It is a constant struggle. I don't think I'm going to reach the exact point where I would like to be. That's going to be maybe in heaven one day or something like that. But how can we create the situation here where the institutions are moving us in the right direction? And we're still a long way off. And I think that brings into this last book here. And I want to talk about the No Due Date as well, that group you have. But Money and the Rule of Law with Alex Salter, who's a good friend, and Daniel Smith. In some ways, I don't know if you meant to do this, but when I was looking over these books and getting ready for our conversation, there has been a mainline, if you will, track between your books. And you've hinted at some rules, and there's too much discretion for these politicians and the political mindset of how they're thinking about things. And then it's kind of come into this magnus opus where you're saying, look, we need rules so that all these other things can happen. The 4 pillars of economic understanding and everything. Yeah. So that way these politicians aren't throwing us off from getting to the direction we needed to be.
Yeah. So I like, look, going all the way back to your first question, and I'm biased in this regard because I'm the weirdo. So, when I first started teaching economics, my best friend, Steve Horowitz and Dave Perchitko, those were my two best friends. And Dave and I were a year ahead of Steve in school. So we got to start teaching a year before he did. And we're teaching, and I'm upset because I don't have 100%, conversion rate to economics majors. I'm teaching, Econ 101, and I think, my God, they just listened to me talk about how wonderful economics is. They should all be economics majors. And Dave, we're at lunch one day, and Dave looks up at me and he says, Pete, haven't you realized that we're the weird ones? Like, just go back to college and recognize how many other kids were in that same class as you, and they never took another economics class. And not only did you take more economics classes, you decided to go to graduate school to take economics. And I'm like, well, that's because they didn't understand. Because we're the weird ones, right? So to me, I think there's so much power in teaching economic literacy. And by teaching economics, I mean something much broader than just being in the classroom. You doing this podcast is teaching economics, right? Alex Salter, when he writes a Wall Street Journal op-ed, is teaching economics, right? So teaching economics is a very broad category for me, right? But I think the appropriate way to teach economics is actually those 4 pillars that you mentioned. And so the first one is that shock and awe of learning the beauty of that. We live in a world of scarcity. Scarcity implies these trade-offs, and that, the logic of pursuing those trade-offs. And that's just beautiful logic. The second thing is economics teaches us a sense of awe, and that's in the spontaneous order, the beauty of the interconnectedness of markets throughout the globe and the way in which they coordinate to produce even the most ordinary goods and services, but the vast division of labor and being able to understand that. And then third, economics gives us hope, because it's through entrepreneurship that we're able to actually lift people up from the, from dire, miserable poverty, that we have, hope in entrepreneurship in the private sector. We have hope for entrepreneurship in the public sector. If we just change the rules of the game, we could live so much more prosperously and peacefully with one another. And then finally, and I think this is the biggest problem that people have, is that economics is about compassion. It never was about how do I make the wealthy better off. It's always how can the least advantaged in society be lifted up. And with that comes, in fact, the rich get richer, obviously, right? But the poor get richer faster than the rich are getting richer, right? And this is what we see with these amazing. So to me, I think going from Smith all the way to today, as Smith says, a society cannot be prosperous if the vast majority of it is living in misery, right? And so we worry about. So it's this shock and awe of the beautiful logic of economics. It's the awe of the beauty of the spontaneous order. It's the hope that entrepreneurship gives us, and it's the compassion that a free society brings to the least advantaged by opening up these opportunities to them. And I think if we taught economics with those 4 pillars rather than economics as a set of techniques for social control, that we would in fact have a better understanding in the public space about what economics is. Now, I might be wrong about that, right? And thank God there's contestation. There's other economics professors that would challenge me in that kind of view. But that's my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that if we actually taught economics in this way, we would empower people to see the beautiful logic of economics, but also the great opportunities for themselves to better themselves and to better their families and better their communities through their own free agency, right? Through their own free agency. And so, and by recognizing that agency, we actually empower more and more people, right, to have respect and dignity, right? There's dignity in work. there's dignity in you know, thinking and coming up with new ideas that could provide better resources to other people that previously didn't have access to them. And so anyway, I know I'm blathering on some about this, but I get very excited about what economics can deliver in the public space, but not necessarily what economics can deliver, you know, by fixing government, but instead by changing the conversation in the society, which will then put pressure on the government to behave differently. So at the end of the day, it's about ideas. That's, you know, we need to have our ideas out there and understood and respected, and that what our science can actually teach. Our science is a science. It's a young science, but it's a science, and we need to actually, and so, you know, to me, when I hear a lot of proposals that are, you know, done and way things like it, it's as similar to like what would happen if a physicist was listening to people and say that, you know, someone came up with the idea, if you flap your arms, you can fly to the moon. And then he led like a whole town to the edge of a cliff and said, okay, let's flap our arms and we'll fly to the moon. And I'm sitting there saying, no, don't do that. And then they all go off and they go crashing down and say, oh, well, that was a bad experiment or whatever. To me, that's what we're doing all the time in economics. And so we need to be there. We need to be out there. But how do we counter that? The most effective way to counter that is to be able to have economic literacy and these kind of efforts that you're doing, and podcasts and blogs and op-eds and videos and all that stuff. You know, we just got to try across the board teaching economics in a university, in a high school, in a junior college. You know, we need to be there and have our voice heard about what our discipline can offer in terms of a set of eyeglasses to understand the world out the window. Yep,
and that's exactly right. Well, Pete, I could talk to you all day, and I did want to mention you got a great group, this No Due Date group. I'll put a link to that also in our show notes. Some good conversations every month. There's a new book that comes in and has some good readings and good discussion with the group, and bring on some of the authors and other thinkers who can talk about some of those key books. And I really enjoyed it.
It's a great idea that Amy Willis had at Liberty Fund, and she asked me to curate for it. And it's you know, my you know, silly effort to try to have the Oprah book club, but for you know, for economics. You know, we need more and more people there. Some of the best participants, as you know, have been high school teachers that come and do it. We're reading this month. We're going to be reading Ryan Hanley's book on Adam Smith called Our Great Purpose, which is what can Adam Smith help teach us about our great purpose. It's mainly an examination of Smith's a theory of moral sentiments, how we can be better people. But it's great. But we've had McCloskey and read McCloskey's book and a bunch of other ones.
We had book on Bastiat.
Bastiat and the great Paul Hain, and you know, so we're struggling to get through and keep doing it. It's great. I've enjoyed it tremendously, and it's a great idea that Amy had, and I hope that the participants are enjoying it. But for your listeners, you know, just look up No Due Date on Facebook page or whatever, and think about subscribing, and you can join. And 2023 will be even a better year. You know, so we're learning.
We're going to keep struggling, you know, to find that better world, Pete. And I appreciate everything you do, and the purpose that you've provided for so many others, including myself, are much appreciated. And so I look forward to continue our conversations and having another one of these discussions soon. But I think that we went through a lot. I'll have to listen to it all again just to let it sink in some. But thank you again for being on the Let People Prosper show, Pete.
Thank you very much, Vance. And the one thing I will tell you is I love having this conversation a lot more than the ones we had.
That's right. Well, and also, you know, we were talking earlier, but thanks for all the work. You know, you went over to Texas Tech, my alma mater, and Ben Powell and the great work the Free Market Institute's doing there. So hopefully we'll have to meet up again sometime in Texas.
I love it there, and I love what Ben's doing, and I recommend to everyone, especially those in Texas, to look at what Ben's doing, because
that's right. Phenomenal. That's right. All right, Pete. Well, thanks again. And thank you for listening today. This is the Let People Prosper show. Until next time, have a prosperous day.